We pick up our story with Max heading off to his new job and Edna waiting in Idaho Springs for their furniture to arrive. The next morning, as Max walked off with duffel and sleeping bag to the Forest Service office on Minor Street, I waved until he turned the corner, not knowing when I would see him next. Mount Evans, where he would live until the snows drove him down, is not visible from Idaho Springs, as the mountains around the town hide the 14,000 peak from view. Turning back, I went into the big front room Mrs. Marshall had given us in her boarding house. Mrs. Marshall was in her 80s, a short, heavy-set woman with a deep and often booming, husky voice. She saw me as I came in and followed me into the room where Rolf was still sleeping in his small portable bed. "I know it's hard for you and you're worried, but tell you what," she continued, I can let you have this room for $3.50 a week. Can't go any lower." I was astounded, knowing that it was a $25 a week room. All the while she was talking, she had been picking up the diapers, and before I could protest, she was off to wash them for me. Several days later, the notice came that our furniture had arrived not at Idaho Springs, but at a town named Kremling. Where in the earth is Kremling, I wondered. I asked Mrs. Marshall, and she told me it was on US 40 over Loveland Pass, through Winter Park and Hot Sulphur Springs. It was about 100 miles away, but only 40 miles north of Dillon. "I've never driven over a mountain pass," I said. "This one's paved and not as high as Loveland, a bit under timberline," she assured me. The moving company notice had taken its own good time in getting to me. A small notation on the bottom stated, "Must be picked up by July 1, no later." And this was June 30th. "I'd better go first thing in the morning," I told Mrs. Marshall. Bright and early, I was ready to leave with Rolf ensconced in the back seat, happily exploring his toes. As I watched him play, I reflected that I'd better be just as nonchalant. Berthoud Pass, I discovered to my delight, was no problem. I even found I could enjoy the magnificent scenery. There were big snowfields and huge overhanging cornices. What fun to ski down that, I thought, not knowing a thing about avalanches. Winding down into the valley, I came to Winter Park, a famous ski area I'd read about in the American Ski Annual. I parked the car at the side of the road and looked up at the T-bar lift and the ski trails. They looked steep and long to me. I wondered if I'd ever get to ski there. But I must hurry on and figure out what to do with our furniture. From Winter Park, the mountains receded on both sides, and the valley became wider and lonelier. Arriving at Kremling, I found the railway express station in the old railroad building on the tracks beside the Colorado River. This day was my first view of that famous river, starting as a small creek in the mountains that I'd just come over. Eventually, it goes all the way through the Grand Canyon and onto California and Mexico. Here it flowed along slowly and gently through the green mountain meadows. To find an unfriendly person was not what I expected. In the express window, a sour-faced fellow looked at my notice card and said, "You've got till tomorrow to get your furniture out, and here's your bill." The bill was huge, $142? Why, I'd only have $10 left. "How will I get this hauled to Dillon?" I asked. "Dunno, lady, that's your problem." He pulled the window down in my face. Everything was crated, even my dust mop when I walked into the storage place where the furniture was stacked. No wonder it cost so much. But where were Max's and my skis? I knocked at the window that had just been slammed down in my face. My skis, I shouted at him. Where are they? Probably got put off in Chicago. Grudgingly, he said he would send a tracer. My heart was already in my shoes, only $10 left, and Max up at 14,000 feet with no phone. I would have no more money until he got his check of $90 at the end of the month from the Forest Service. Actually, there'd only be $80 after they took out his rent. And now our skis were lost. I drove to a dusty side street to park and nurse my baby. I cried pretty hard and wondered, what do I do now? Well, I thought, it's not going to help sitting here. I drove to the town square and looked around. Two women were gossiping outside of a newly painted building with big red letters on the false front, Del Rio Cafe. The cafe wasn't open, so I approached the women. Does anyone haul freight to Dillon? Well, one of the women said while looking me up and down, that fellow over there talking to the blacksmith might haul to Dillon, seeing as how he lives there. The other woman smiled at me and asked, you a wife of one of them ski troopers from Camp Hale? Oh, no, I answered. My husband is working for the Forest Service. That there is Roy Cole talking to the blacksmith. With this information, I approached the two men. How was I going to tell them I only had a $10 traveler's check, besides some change and a few bills? I blurted it out, my whole story. They could hear Ralph starting to cry in the car. Mr. Cole broke into a big grin and said, I usually haul coal to Dillon, but I'll meet you at 8 o'clock in the morning on the main street of Dillon, and you can tell me where you want the furniture. And it'll only cost you $10. I could have hugged him, in fact, hugged all of them, including the woman who had lifted Ralph out of the back seat and was bouncing him up and down, much to his glee. Arriving back in Idaho Springs late that afternoon, I was elated until suddenly I realized I don't have a house. But I'll get up early and contact the Dillon Forest Ranger. He'd been so kind to Max the summer before. Maybe I'd better leave Ralph with Mrs. Marshall and get over to Dillon tonight to see if I can find a house. Sure, I'll take care of Ralphie, Mrs. Marshall assured me, making it possible for me to leave right away for Dillon. It was getting dusk when I reached Dillon's main street. I parked the car in front of the Heart of the Rockies cabin camp. Whenever someone went in or out of the bars, I could hear honky-tonk music blending with the ring of slot machines. An old cowboy was standing across the street in front of the building, announcing itself as the Mint Saloon. I walked over and asked him if he knew where I might be able to rent a small house. Well, the guy who owns most of the town is in there, Old Man Riley, he said, while pointing with his thumb over his shoulder to the door of the Mint. I entered slowly, and for the first time I felt a bit afraid. In Pennsylvania, women didn't go into bars. I doubted that they even had any bars like this. Maybe they didn't have any bars at all. 3 men were sitting at a small round table playing poker. They were wearing cowboy hats shoved back on their heads. I remember thinking, wow, how strange. They all had such white foreheads. I later noticed that cowboys' faces are tan only up to their hat brims, leaving a definite boundary line whenever they took off their hats. I was surprised I could speak at all when I asked, Mr. Riley? Yep, what do you want? The older of the 3 men looked at me. Gratefully, I realized his manner was not unkind. I need to rent a house, not a big one, I told him. Well, you can have the one across the street. He pointed to the small, false fronted house. It'll cost you $8 a month. I told him I had a little baby and all about Max working for the Forest Service on top of Mount Evans. The Forest Service had said it was too dangerous to bring a small baby to live at that altitude. I explained he'd have to wait a bit for the $8 as I had spent my last traveler's check getting my furniture hauled up from Kremling. I waited while all three men looked at me without saying anything. Then all of a sudden Mr. Riley grinned and said, "That's okay by me. It's almost July. So what about paying me the $8 on August 1st?" He gave me the key, and I happily went across the street to my new abode. Next time we'll find out more about Edna's new home.